Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So it seems as though not all the questions that were asked during the live stream on Sunday on the Chris Watts case were answered, and that led to a few people emailing me or sending me messages and leaving comments with their burning questions. I've chosen the top 5 questions to deal with to answer in this episode. If you've got questions that you feel haven't ever been answered by anyone, then do leave them in a comment, and I'll see if I can get to them in due course. Before we get to today's episode, if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So the first question that came up, and I must say it's a question that comes up very, very often, is why did Chris Watts want to kill his kids? And I think we should pay attention to the word that I've highlighted there, the word want. I don't think he did. I don't think he did want to kill his children. And I think what is very important to bear in mind with the Chris Watts case is that it didn't start, I don't think he started off thinking that he wanted to kill his children. I think that was at the very end of the premeditation, the plotting. So the children came right at the end. And, we need to go through it step by step. I think we tend to come to the Chris Watts case in hindsight and go, wow, we just annihilated his family. And we don't recognize who he is as a person. Probably we don't want to. We don't recognize or realize who Shanann was. We don't try and pay attention to who these people were, almost like characters in a story. And we also don't pay attention to Nicole Kessinger other than just demonizing her. Now, in the same way, when you start to think about Chris Watts in a neutral way, you just think, okay, what actually happened here? The way that the premeditation started was that Chris Watts really did a big U-turn on the pregnancy. He really felt, although it was his idea to have the third baby in the beginning, he changed his mind about that, and then he felt imperiled. He felt he was in a serious bind. And he did speak to Shanann about it. He said he was scared to death having the third child. He repeatedly brought it up, and Shanann obviously wasn't going to countenance that. She wasn't going to have an abortion. She had told everyone on Facebook what was going on. So what was she going to do? And so it started off, for Chris Watts, it started off wanting to kill the baby, wanting to have an abortion, wanting to prevent Nico from coming into the world. So that was the beginning of it. Then the next step was, because Shanann wouldn't do it on his behalf or on their behalf, it then became, well, in order to kill Nico, the only way to do that was by killing Shanann, right? And when he reached that point, he then thought about killing the children as well. And possibly during the weekend that he spent alone with them, he was thinking about it. I think he was also thinking about how much he missed them when he was apart from them, and how they treated him when he was with them again. And also, he didn't even want to be there. He knew when he was in North Carolina, he felt, I don't really want to be with my family. I want to be somewhere else. And I think even when he was back in Colorado, he felt the same way. I don't want to be with my children. I want to be somewhere else. And that, I think, sealed the deal, right? I think that is the glossing over of that answer. I think the other thing that you've got to look at is you've got to look at it from the psychology of what was going on, the family dynamics. And it's something I brought up many, many times, Watts no longer had a close relationship with his children due to several factors. Now you might say, how on earth can you lose that closeness in such a short time? But I don't think it was such a short time. You could say 5 weeks is a very short time, but it's not really. If you don't see someone for more than a month, I think that is enough time for a wedge to develop. I think Nutgate, where Shanann effectively gave Watts an out, that his parents would never see his children again. Now bear in mind, at that point, so on the 6th of August, when Chris Watts wanted to take his children to their grandparents, to his parents, so I think at that point he was still somewhat invested in them. But when Shanann said he couldn't, I think there was a part of him that was throwing in the towel, right? Shanann effectively gave him an out when she, because of Nutgate, said that his parents would never see his children again. And so I think if he was thinking about it, if he was flirting with the idea, if he was just fantasizing about what things could be like, obviously in a horrible and grotesque way, if they disappeared, they'd blame her, right? That was his game. That was his plan. Being separated from them for 5 weeks was another big part of it. In other words, every day that went by, I don't think he really thought about them. I don't think he missed them. I think as he was growing, as he was separating from his family and the idea of being a parent and a father, as he was disconnecting, right, as he was separating, he was at the same time getting closer to Kessinger. He was getting more connected to her. There was a sense of investment and relationship with her. The other thing that was happening was that he was liking the person he was becoming. He liked his freedom. He liked that he had perhaps some money to spend. He liked that someone was listening to him. He liked that when he was with Kessinger, it wasn't all about chores and things that he needed to do that he didn't really want to do. When he was with Kessinger, he wanted to be with her. When he was with Kessinger, even if she asked him to do something, he felt he wanted to do it. And I must say, I've experienced that myself, where you might be with a specific person and they ask you to do something, and it's really, you feel like it's taking quite a lot out of you, whereas another person asking you to do exactly the same thing, you almost want to sort of jump up and do it. And what is going on there? I think the difference is chemistry. The difference is that there are some real feelings, whether they are, whether you want to say that they are deep or shallow, or that they are the right feelings, is a different story. I also think that the children played a role, meaning the children started gravitating and bonding with Shanann during that 5-week period. So if you're going to argue and say, I don't think Chris Watts could have, stopped loving his children, or I don't think Chris Watts could have fell out of love with his family, or I don't think Chris Watts's connection to his children could have been disrupted after just 5 weeks. But I think that was enough time, in a way, for his children to develop a closeness with their mother. I think it was time enough for that closeness to be revealed when he arrived on the scene, that they would be quite iffy towards him. Bear in mind, things were going on in his mind and his heart, and perhaps they registered it. Perhaps his ambivalence was something that made them feel, well, I don't really know what's going on with this dude. I kind of knew him, but he's being a bit strange. I'm going to stick with the safe bet, Mom. I'm going to stick with Mom. And so when they saw him again, I think it simultaneously hurt him that they didn't seem to really care about him, seeing him again. And I think possibly that started reinforcing this subliminal, this slight thought process that was starting to develop. Now, I can also tell you, and it's probably a silly example, when I leave home, and the moment I leave home, my dog starts, there's an Afrikaans word, chunking. It means he just starts crying and shrieking, and it's like it's unbearable. And there was something of that separation anxiety with the children as well, which I think is quite interesting. And you could actually blame me for not making Timmy a little bit more independent, being with him too much, perhaps mollycoddling him or whatever, so that he's always being attended to and whatever. And so he's not used to a certain amount of independence. Bear in mind, I'm a kind of like a stay-at-home dad. I'm at home all day. So he doesn't get actually used to being his own doggy self, right? But what I want to compare it to is the cat. Whether I come or go, the cat sort of doesn't really care. And, you can arrive after whatever the length of time is, and the cat will sort of yawn. I'm not saying it's completely like that, but I've certainly seen cats where you might go on holiday for 2 or 3 weeks and the cat isn't interested at all. If you bring the cat food, it might be. And that can give you can get a sense of being a bit wounded by that. Wow, is that all I'm good for, kind of thing. So I really do think that did happen. The children gravitated to Shanann, bonded with Shanann. It may actually have been going on longer than just the 5-week thing, but if anything, the 5-week thing cemented that. And I think other things were going on, them throwing chicken nuggets at him. Although he was joking about it, I don't think he was very happy about it. Them repeating insults or slurs Shanann said about him. This was something he brought up. I think it was something that really hurt him. And you can kind of imagine a scenario where Shanann is a lady and her children are 2 little girls, and so they can identify a lot with one another. Whether it's doing one another's hair, choosing clothes, shopping, clothing, dresses, whatever it is. There's a lot that they can identify with, playing with dolls. Whereas Chris Watts, no matter what kind of a good dad he is, I don't know if he can really share his love of sports or to some extent exercise with his little girls, even if he was trying his best to, make them part of his experience. And so, yes, I think when Shanann felt displeasure and the children repeated what she said, it was kind of a moment of amusing solidarity for the 3 of them, and then he was left out. There are also Facebook posts where Shanann talks about, the kids want to be with her, and then there's a picture of Chris Watts on the couch. No one wants to be with him. And that had to be really painful. Even though he was laughing at that, even though it was funny, I can imagine that being quite a hurtful, like in a private way. I think that would be something that would wound him, and something that he would wonder, isn't that true possibly? And so I think you have those things which are touchy-feely and warm and fuzzy stuff, but I think there was also, very importantly, their role in his debt burden, the children's role in his debt burden. So if Shanann was out of the way and Nico was out of the way, they would still need to go to school. They would still need to be looked after. There would still be health costs, and let's face it, especially Cece, the whole Nutgate thing probably reminded him that Cece, you're going to have to be very, very careful taking care of her, because, she eats the wrong food. She might need to go to hospital, and he would need to worry about that for the rest of her life, kind of thing. So does that answer your question? Why did Chris Watts want to kill his kids? It's to some extent because it was the logical, in the criminal sense, it was the logical end to the premeditation that started with Nico. The other side is just that the glue holding them together was unraveling, loosening, whatever. And then the third aspect, which is, I still think, quite significant, is the finances. Okay, does that make sense? Then the second question, and I'm not going to spend too much time answering this, if he went through weeks of planning everything out, then how come he didn't realize the truck in the garage would look really bad for him? It does look really bad for him, but I think you've sort of answered your question with the word if. I don't think he did go through weeks of planning. I think he went through a couple of days of planning. I think the planning really sort of took root around about August the 9th, when Nicole Kessinger gave him her key. I think there was a cloud of criminal temptation that was sort of floating through his mind. So I think on the one hand he had these fantasies about Kessinger. I think often when that was interrupted by texts and complaints and getting into trouble with Shanann, I think he increasingly felt, I'm going to have to do something about this. I'm going to have to fix this. I'm going to have to sort this out. I don't think it went on for weeks. I don't think he planned it for weeks. And one of the reasons we know is that he contacted his co-workers on essentially the Sunday night to arrange access to the well site. And also there was, to some extent, getting to know a little bit about Survey 319 on the Friday, if you remember. I don't get the feeling that he planned it for weeks. It may have been in his mind in a vague way for weeks, and certainly I think the attempt on Nico's life started on the 31st of July, the day that he returned from, not the day that he returned, the day that he arrived in North Carolina, but obviously indirectly returning from the Great Sand Dunes. I do think the Great Sand Dunes thing was a big game changer in his life as well. I think he thought that was like a little bit of a mini honeymoon, and I think he thought, I want more of this. I want this life with her. I don't want that life with them. And if he thought that then when he went to North Carolina, I think it only strengthened the sense that, wow, I'm miserable here. I'd rather be there. I'd rather be with her. So I think if you're going to talk about weeks of planning, I think at the most it was 2 weeks. And I don't think he was really planning it like he was sitting by a desk carefully planning it out. I think it was quite haphazard. I don't think he had a lot of time to plan. I think he was quite sleep deprived. He was sort of, trying to keep the affair going and texting late at night. I think he was burning the candle at both ends. And because of that, I think he was running on empty, and Thrive Patches was sort of keeping him going. And I think he thought he knew what he was doing, but he was actually, it was almost like the carpet was being pulled out from under him. He was struggling to keep up with everything that was going on. And so, if you talk about weeks of planning, I don't think he planned how he wanted to deal with Nico very well. It might have come down to 1 or 2 Google searches and a little bit around that, but really not a lot of planning. The same with the disposal of his family. I don't think he really thought about, if Shanann doesn't post on Facebook and she just disappears, what are people going to think? I don't think he really thought it through. So I don't think there were weeks of planning. I think there were maybe a couple of days or perhaps even hours, and I don't think he planned it out in a lot of detail. I think in terms of the truck and the garage, I think the fact that he got away with the affair for as long as he did, and that the neighbors didn't say anything, probably made him think that he could get away with it. I also think the fact that he was doing what he was doing and his work colleagues didn't seem to know any better, and also some of his work colleagues, and then someone like Jeremy Lindstrom and his wife didn't really notice anything different at that birthday party. I think he thought if he just plays his game, the low-key reserved thing. He can probably get away with it. And I do think the hairs on the back of his neck probably went up a little bit, knowing this camera was on him, but I think he sort of assumed that there would be some, what do you call it, not lethargy, but laziness, that people just wouldn't notice or they wouldn't really do anything, right? And if the police weren't called that day, who knows what would have happened to that footage, So I hope that answers that question. Number 3, let me just add another thing. So I think he was just hoping people wouldn't notice the CCTV footage from Nathaniel Trinasic's house. I think he was also hoping the foliage of the perimeter trees would provide some cover, as well as the dark. And to be fair, if the CCTV footage was entered as evidence in court in a trial, I don't think it would have been enough to prove anything either way. If anything, I think it would have helped the defense case. You would have said, well, there's reasonable doubt to say, or whatever the prosecution said. And that is exactly what happened with the CCTV footage of Patrick Frazee going into Kelsey Bereth's home. You had the same situation, CCTV footage, which on the one hand you could argue was damning, but on the other hand, it wasn't really damning enough. And you could argue that because of that, it almost proved that the guy was innocent, or couldn't prove that he was guilty. So the third question is, why would he risk putting the girls in the oil tanks when a co-worker could possibly find them in there? And I've highlighted the word possibly just because I don't think it was very likely that a co-worker would find them in there. We know this because when Chris Watts was being interrogated, this was on Wednesday afternoon, going into the evening. So he'd already confessed. They knew that the 3 bodies were at the well site. And even when he told them that they were in the oil tanks, they just couldn't see them. They couldn't find them. So even though you had investigators on the site with the thief hatches open and them looking inside, they couldn't find them. And bear in mind, it's not like opening the door to a room. You sort of open the door and you can take your time, look under a bed, and carefully, go through things systematically. An oil tank like that, you can't breathe. There are all sorts of safety hazards. It's dark. It's toxic. It's not a place you really want to spend much time looking for something. And if a body is thrown in there, it's covered in oil, you're not going to be able to really see it. Bear in mind, there's also often a smoke or fumes that are coming out that get in the way of seeing anything. So it's not at all easy. I did think when this was the beginning of the case, I did wonder, surely there are sensors that measure changes, fluctuations in volume, in acidity, and so on. I'm not quite sure how fracking works, but I assume if there are sudden changes in something like alkalinity, they might throw in certain acids to adjust these levels. I'm not quite sure how they do it. But, I don't think there was... I think, if you think back to the Chris Watts case, no one could actually believe that the girls were even in the tanks. Even when people were told they were in the tanks, people still couldn't believe it. And they couldn't actually believe that the girls would fit in the tanks, and it turned out they just could. So, does that make sense? So, just to summarize, I don't think it was easy to find anything in those tanks. And in terms of a co-worker finding them, I think what he was hoping was that their bodies would dissolve into nothing. He refers to the word vanished several times during the sermon on the porch. That is what I think he wanted to happen to the children. I think he knew what he was doing was taboo. I think he knew what he was doing was kind of breaking the laws of God, and he wanted them to just totally disappear so that he would be free. He wanted them to vanish and to dissolve into nothing. And I think given enough time, they would have vanished. They would have dissolved via a chemical breakdown, right? So if that did happen, I don't think you would have a situation of a co-worker possibly finding them. Right, and then that brings us to question 4. How do you find the discovery files? I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I was one of the first to upload tranches of the discovery. I must have uploaded easily over 50 tranches, just selections of the discovery that had to do with whatever this police officer's observations, that evidence, Coda's first FBI interview. It really took a long time to put it all together. I put lots and lots and lots of screen grabs onto crimerocket.com. The efforts I did to do that were later sabotaged, and I had to move the archive off WordPress. And at the time I was actively running the site, it was probably the best archive on the net. If you wanted information, if you Googled something on Chris Watts, you would automatically, Google would send you to Crime Rocket. But as a result of this interference, I kind of thought it's just not worth it. It's not worth doing so much work for free, and then you have these difficulties. And so I also provided the original download link to the discovery files. That was actually on crimerocket2.com, and unfortunately that link has been taken down or deactivated by Weld County. There were a few creators who acted fast and downloaded the discovery documents and media. There was video and sort of multimedia amounting to about 3 terabytes. I was one of those who acted quickly. As I said, I did my best to actually provide the discovery for you guys for free. And anyway, that's ancient history now. So number 5, I have to wonder why the 2 little girls were not buried with their mother. It seems inconsistent that they were not. What could have possibly been the motive for not doing so? He had already dug the grave, just make it bigger. Odd. Theories, anyone? I think I'm just going to revert to what I said earlier. He was trying to make them all disappear permanently. And I think if he could have fit Shanann in the tanks, he would have. I think if you're making the argument about just dig the grave bigger, I think it probably would have taken less time to dump the children into the tanks than to dig the amount of sand that would be enough to bury the children there. I do think there's a clue in your question that is worth looking at, just where you say it seems inconsistent that they were not buried with their mother. And I think the reason is that I think his love for his children was inconsistent with his love for Shanann. I think the fact of what he did to his children was so shocking to him that I think he really wanted their bodies totally destroyed, that he wouldn't be reminded of it. Whereas I think the decision to kill Shanann was not as difficult as it was his children. And I also think that I get the sense, I could be wrong, but I get the sense that there was some sadistic satisfaction in what he did to Shanann. Burying her face down. According to him, when he sort of pulled the sheet, and I apologize for this graphic, but she sort of fell quite heavily into the ground, and he didn't do anything about that. I kind of get the sense that he felt it was just desserts, just based on his experience with her. Who knows, it's possible that he felt something like that with his children as well. I don't really get that sense. I think that he probably felt a sense of grim determination, but also I think there was a part of him that was quite sad about what he was doing. And right next to that sadness was the sense of shame and taboo, and he really wanted to make sure that they wouldn't ever be found. But I think the inconsistent burial is because of feelings that were inconsistent between himself and Shanann and himself and the children. I think, if he, as I said previously, if he was thinking about what he was doing, I don't really think he wanted to kill his children. I think it sort of started off with Nico, and then it was Shanann, and then the children were sort of almost like collateral damage. But I do think he felt that it was necessary to do that, otherwise he wouldn't have done it. Anyway, I hope you found this episode illuminating. If you got any other questions, please let me know. If you disagree on some of the answers, let me know. It would be interesting to see what you think. I do think you're going to have a good idea about this case when you've got a good idea who Chris Watts is and who Shanann was and who Nicole Kessinger was. And for as long as you think of them as cardboard cutouts and you've got this shallow or superficial idea of who these people are, what they did isn't going to make sense. You only get to the why by knowing the who, and you only get to the who by knowing the why. But I think it is easier to get to the who, and from the who we get to the more difficult aspect, which is the why. For those Watts case followers who only follow the Watts case, I want to invite you to listen in to the Khan's Order, my next episode on the JonBenet Ramsey case. That'll be on YouTube following this episode. So look out for that. Even if you're not interested in the JonBenet Ramsey case, just give it a try. You might find it quite interesting. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.